to ensure that whoever they want to really see at any given time, you can do that. I'll just now I'm just going to do a couple of things. Oops. So Rob, I'm going to make yourself and I'm going to make Nora, both of you, co-hosts, so that it's easier for you to mute and unmute. If you find someone's asking a question that's just too hard, you can just mute them.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, we're in this modern era of cancel culture and things like that. We can do all sorts of things to stop people from talking in public. So that's going to be very cool. It's a few minutes past 8, and I thought, well, hang on, everyone's just filing in. Might actually turn off the wait room now. Okay, so now people are going to be able to just file in, and that'll be great. I just want to make sure that we're coming. Yeah, good. So we've got a few people who have opted just to watch on YouTube. They can put it on their big screen then, on their smart TV, rather than on their phone or computer. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Schmooze. That sounded a bit like it already sounds like a stage show. The purpose of this, actually, I went for a walk today with is actually on the chat, and I'm happy to go for walks with anyone because we are allowed to walk with one other person unless things change. But I went for a walk with Mel Lewis today, and we were talking about how I quite embrace my ADD method of learning and exploring. And one thing people often tell me is that what they enjoy more than a lecture is being part of a conversation. There's so much more that you can talk about when topics move along, but when you're anchored to a advertised topic or something like that, you kind of become constrained. You also have a lot of expectations of the speaker, and so by initiating a conversation with interesting people, who knows what can be pulled out of our mind. But we are going to try to stick to a particular area of conversation, but where Nora, Rob, wherever we end up, that's absolutely fine because it is a conversation and not a Q&A. So if I could ask everyone just to keep their microphones on mute, and then we'll unmute from time to time to expand, as I said earlier. And the reason why I chose Rob and Nora initially to be a part of this conversation is because I've had the good fortune of learning with both of them at different times, and both of them we took a very conversant style of learning. So with Rob was actually part of a group of psychiatrists that we would have a share, and I used to have to prepare around 10 minutes worth of content, and with that we knew we had an hour and a half conversation on who knows what. And with Nora, I found that generally for a 60-minute share, I only need to prepare 30 minutes because I can never prepare for the questions that she might have or where she may want to steer. So I pretty much just launch with a topic. I make sure I've researched it well, and then I'm fairly comfortable that wherever it spins off, it does. So I thought, why not we just blend the ways that we have naturally learned off camera to being the way that we're going to learn tonight on camera. So I thought maybe we could start with an interesting topic for someone who's looks at the world from the corporate space, and then someone else who looks at the world from the prism of psychiatry, whether actively or inactive or subtly, subconsciously. What I noticed over the last week when the state government came out with the whole mask thing, that we had to wear masks and this date was coming, there was a similar response to, before we even get to the masks, the similar response was to when they said you have to stay in your postcode region. So if you can go fishing somewhere closer, you've got to fish closer. If you can go to a park that's close, you've got to go somewhere closer. And Dan Andrews used language like, you've just got to use your common sense. And he said that, and then everyone was like, well, I live 50 meters away from the beach. I live on the other side of an Nepean highway, but it's a different postcode. Am I allowed to go? or I've got this park here, but am I allowed to go to that park? Or my children need this slide, can I go to that slide? And as soon as the government said, use your common sense, everyone said, give us definition and articulate what you mean. And then the other way around was whenever the government says you have to do it like this, that, and the other, everyone says, oh, please, a bit of common sense so we can look after ourselves. And I just find it really interesting. Why is it that when we're asked to use common sense, we push back? And when we're given specific guidelines, we push back? What is it about people? And is it a reflection of where we are at right now as a Western society, or is this a human condition? Does this play out in other areas? And before I share any Talmudic things, I just thought maybe either of you have some perspective on why people are behaving like this, and maybe they're not, and I'm just dramatizing it.
You go ahead, Nora, please.
Okay, so if I think about it from large businesses, in many ways, when all of this started, a lot of the large businesses were sort of ahead of government even. So, and you know, they sent their people to work from home before it was mandated. A lot of the essential services, the utilities, the banks, stepped up and offered people, you know, either waivers or deferrals on payments. And a lot of companies that had probably programs of continuing workforce reductions paused them because it would have been the wrong thing to do to people off as all of this was taking place. And in a sense, the decisions were easy. They seemed pretty obvious and easy. So you didn't need great definition around rules. In fact, people were ahead of the rules. And within businesses, I think by and large, again, in larger companies, everyone's sort of patting themselves on the back on how well we've done and how quickly our people adapted to digital, how people mobilized. Suddenly, programs that previously would have taken 3 years were suddenly being done in 3 weeks, and how quickly everyone sort of adapted and were able to deliver. And in a sense, as dramatic as the circumstances were, it was sort of easy. Now it's getting a lot harder because the decisions are now not that obvious. So those same companies that paused some of those programs around workforce reductions. So, and they're keeping people on because of JobKeeper or programs like that. So are you doing the right thing by your people by keeping them in jobs that effectively probably don't exist anymore, and delaying the time when you're actually going to be upfront and straight with them? And yes, they will be terminated and will have to go into the market to look for jobs. Are you doing them a favor by not doing that now and delaying it, when in fact, when JobSeeker and all of those other programs start getting pulled, the employment market will be even more competitive and they'll be having to compete with this tsunami of people coming onto the employment market? Are you doing the right thing by continuing to give people waivers or deferrals on payments of rent or utilities, etc. now? What's going to magically change when in 6 months' time all the support gets pulled and suddenly they're expected to recover to a point where they're going to be able to pay all those accrued liabilities? You know, do you bring people back to the office? On one hand, people are saying we miss the social interaction and the physical contact, but then they're scared of traveling on public transport. How are you going to manage the workplace? And you probably can't fit the pick. So the decisions are now a lot harder. So if government actually says you can do this or you can't do this, in a sense, it actually takes some of that difficulty out of the equation. So, you know, when the answer seems really clear cut, people are happy not to sort of have the rules. But when they're much harder decisions and what's the right thing to do, and there are so many different people with an interest, and they'll be affected differently. And sometimes it's nice to have somebody else take the decisions, I think.
So do you think government, it's so interesting because I never looked at it like that the government are actually stepping in because it's become too hard. And that's because, I've got a couple of comments just for those of you that don't know Nora. Nora is very much involved in the big company world, sits on a number of publicly listed company boards. So that's going to be a very different perspective, because I look at the world, of course, as a rabbi, as a dad, involved in a small organization relative to the large industry. And so to me, I never even thought about, I probably read about it, but never even thought about that. Yeah, companies did take steps well before the government said you have to do this or that. So you're saying the government stepped in at the point that it was becoming too hard for people to just work with common sense, or for the larger end of town, the big companies, the people who are probably responsible for a lot of people's lives. As it became too hard, the government had to step in.
Well, I'm not sure they thought about it on that basis, but I think, in a sense, by not mandating certain things, then you'll have to be prepared that people will make those judgment calls from very different positions, and the outcome then for society might not be what a government at the time thinks is the right thing. And the reality also is that I think they're doing it also because government either doesn't want or can't perhaps afford to step up to do all of those things. And so, like it or not, they're basically getting business to do part of the heavy lifting for government as well.
See, that's a really interesting perspective, Nora, because I'd never even appreciated that perspective before. I mean, I do look at the world through a psychological lens, and it's just one of those, once it's like a religion, I guess. I can't disavow it. This is just how I look at the world. So the way that I look at the world is that, first of all, that just to underline some things, that I think the government's doing a good job, both federally and state, doing a really good job with very, very little certainty about what is the precise way to go. The second thing, just before I get to answer your question, Menachem, is that you've got to listen to experts. These guys, the chief health medical officer, the chief health officer, premier, prime minister, all these people, they're operating with a whole lot of data and a whole lot of opinion and a whole lot of experts that are feeding into what they are saying. So it's not just, oh, I've got this idea, I'm going to bring X, Y, and Z in now. So for me, I think listening to experts is the thing to do. And these are bona fide experts in the position of government. So why do people have different reactions? Well, first of all, I think people are scared a lot of the time. And so when you're scared, you begin to question things. You're not sure if it's right. We're all worried about uncertainty. And so we question the processes and the rules that government have brought in to say, where's the evidence? How do we know? How do you know? What about this aspect? What happens to business or the economy when we lock down schools and we lock down people and we lock down postcodes? Then you get other people saying, you get health experts saying, well, we should lock it down more. So there's always going to be these chattering voices vying for what they think is important. But it's really only I think the government, which has all the different streams of information, that they can make a balanced decision. Having said that, people are always, as you and I talked before, Menachem, people are going to have this sort of Talmudic attitude to it. They're going to be asking lots and lots of questions and expecting lots and lots of answers. And in a situation where there aren't answers, where we don't know, people are going to get worried. And this is what's happening. And the whole idea of, and I don't think anybody, I wouldn't know, but I don't think anybody's going to be fined if they step across the Nepean highway out of their postcode. These laws are not meant to be, revenue raising. They're supposed to be basically, use use your common sense. I mean, there is common sense there. Don't go out too far, wear a mask, socially distance, all those things now I think are fairly common sense. I mean, there may be a few which we still kind of grapple around, like, how many, how do you exercise around people and that sort of stuff. And, do masks protect you as protect people around you? So there's still a few things we're grappling with, but I think in general, people have been very good, very, very good about it, and are using their common sense generally.
So it's interesting. Yeah, sorry, Nora, you go.
Your comment about experts is also really interesting, and goes to that whole thing of who we trust these days. And so, again, we come out of last year, the whole Royal Commission on Banking, and so there's this thing called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which comes out every year, and it's actually a global study, and they survey communities all around the world and come up with who's up or down in the trust sort of barometer. And as of last year, sort of government, business, media, both conventional and social media, were all in the gutter. Interestingly, one of the few ones that started to emerge from that, and experts, of course, we've seen what's happened in climate change and those debates, where suddenly the science didn't seem to matter anymore. And I guess that seemed to be much more the case over in the US, say, than here, but we've seen enough of it here as well. So it's who does the society trust to look for? And I think one of the really good things that we've seen in COVID is that actually suddenly government has acknowledged that the medical experts, really have the prime role now to guide us through this. And it'll be that point again when you've got this debate ongoing about, how do you balance the economy versus health? But at the moment, thankfully, the expert has risen again, at least in the medical field.
It's interesting what you said earlier, Rob, about will they actually hand out fines, let's say $200 fines for not wearing a mask? And you were saying, well, obviously not, or hopefully not. In the Gemara, there's a discussion about what is the definition of a bloodthirsty court, because we have capital punishment in Judaism. And there's discussion about a death once in 7 years at the hands of the court is considered bloodthirsty. And then it goes all the way through to an opinion that says if the court found someone guilty of a capital punishment and executed them once in 70 years, there was a death on the court's hands, that was considered a bloodthirsty court, because surely they should have been able to find a way to acquit someone. And so the question becomes, and what's the point of a capital punishment system if you're never allowed to actually met it out? Like, if you can't deliver on it, and you can't have a really good quality stoning or a good hanging, a bit of barbaric behavior to keep the hordes happy, then what's the point of it? And so some of the commentaries say that actually the purpose of the capital punishments, or any punishment in the Torah, is not actually to deliver on that punishment, but more to use a language that some people, this is the only language they understand, that the severity of your act is like killing someone, that when you do this, the spiritual impact is so negative that it requires the removal of your whole being from this world. So it's not so much you've done it, now we have to kill you, as much as now that you understand how offensive this is to Hashem, how spiritually negative this is as an energy in the world, to the point that it could lead to a death penalty, can you pull back from such behavior? So it'll be interesting, because I also know Victoria is the most fined state since coronavirus began, and all the fines around the country were being given out by police. Victoria has given out more fines than anyone else. So is the police's role to give out those fines, or is it actually to educate? On the radio today, there was someone saying how instead of giving out fines, give out a mask and explain to people why you should be wearing a mask instead of a punishment for not wearing a mask, like to take a far more proactive, I think it was from the Lib Dems. And that, I thought that's a very interesting approach, but does that then soften policing? And can society really work on such an empowered, educated way, or actually are humans designed that we actually do need a certain amount of governance?
Yeah, I think, laws need teeth, but it's how you police that. Like, when one of my children, her Mikey wasn't loaded and she was on a tram and she got sprung by an inspector, they didn't fine her. They gave her a warning. And now she's 100% sure that she'll always make sure her Mikey is loaded up because of the warning, because of the threat of a fine. And but a law needs the same way with parking fines and speeding fines and all those sorts of things. Look, some of them might be revenue raising, I don't know. But the laws need teeth. Of course they do. But it's how it's policed and how it's enacted that'll be the telling thing about it. It doesn't seem, well, let's wait and see,
But it's also a question of intent. So if it's
yes.
Someone that's, sort of didn't really understand it or didn't think about it, or, hadn't gotten round to it, blah, blah, blah. But if it's some of these cases that we've heard about the last couple of days of, the guys who said that they had a medical emergency to cross the border into South Australia, but as soon as they crossed, they went to the pub. So if there's a deliberate flouting of the rule, then I think it is important that it be enforced.
I was going to tell you, just if we can come back to the idea of experts, can I tell you, I was brought up by my dear father to always be very suspicious of experts. And I've now flipped. He was famous for telling this joke. He said, there are 3 ways to lose money. He said, the first way is to spend it on your girlfriend. And that's the most pleasant way to lose money. You lose some money, go for dinner, you lose some money. The second way is to go to the horses, the races. And that's the quickest way to blow your money. And the third way to lose your money is by taking the advice of experts. That's the surest way of losing money. So, I grew up in an environment where, don't trust experts. But I think, we really need to, because there are so many chattering voices that you will attach your opinion to whoever you like. It's one of those things. Oh, I like that guy's opinion or that lady's opinion. I'll listen to them. That won't cut it in this environment. You really need to listen to people who have got, I really believe this, our best interests at heart, our welfare at heart.
So without trying to sound anti-Semitic, it's very interesting because I don't want to say all Jews, but I'll definitely say that Ashkenazi Jews in the 20th and 21st century have this incredible syndrome of, in Yiddish, the Yiddish word is being an Iberchacham. And Iberchacham is to be smarter, to outsmart and be smarter than everyone else. And there are probably a whole lot of reasons why that is. Maybe it's because as a small community that is so networked with one another, that concept, everyone goes to shul. And so as a 15-year-old, I sat next to a top heart surgeon and I sat next to a top lawyer. And so by the time I was 25, I could call the heart surgeon, no worries, he sits next to me in shul. Or, we all have so many of these ideas. Just parenthetically, there's a mum that told me how much she hates the idea of kids that come out of Jewish day schools. They say, I'm Jewed out. I need a break. And she's like, what are you Jewed out? That you hate the fact that you turn on your phone and you've got access to such incredible people. That's the power of community. Like, you don't want, so hand me your phone. And when you're in trouble, you're not going to call any consul generals. You're going to start at the bottom of the phone call. You're not going to call your neighbor and say, apparently you had dinner with the American ambassador. Can you get me a favor? None of that. You're Jewed out. Anyway, so what was interesting was when we went into before the first lockdown, when the rabbis came out and said, shuls have got to close. And they didn't come out to the community, they came out to each other. And there was a lot of discussion. Some rabbis were like, hang on. The government hasn't said we have to close shul. And to close shul, it's not like, save a life, save the world, close the shul. There's a halachic, there's a law, one has to pray in a quorum. And to pray in a quorum requires a space, and you've got to be within a certain square meterage. You've got to be together. So when they said no shul and no Torah reading, it wasn't just closing of tradition. That was, you're using one law, saving a life, to trump another law, which is you have to daven with a minyan, and all laws are equal in some way. So there was a lot of pushback, like, hang on, in America, people are dying. In New York, people are dying. But in Australia, it hasn't started yet. And remember, this is March. It's very early days. And others were, no, we have to be very preemptive and preventative, and we have to do this. And you know, every rabbi had a whole lot of different doctors on speed dial. I remember I called the head of one of the heads of infectious disease at Geelong Hospital. Her daughter had bat mitzvah at Spiritgrow, and I was like, afterwards, I was like, as if I just called one of the most demanded people in Victoria right now to find out her opinion as to whether Spiritgrow should open or close. But when they did, there was a pushback from elements in the community, which was like, this is over the top. The rabbis are being silly. And then there was another large element that was like, no, the rabbis are not being silly. And I'm putting aside the Rip and Lee group. This is very, very wise and good on them. And that turned into a discussion of, well, are the rabbis specialists? And who are the doctors they're consulting with? Are they consulting with community GPs? What information do they have? And why aren't they sharing that information? There was this really interesting discussion. And then when people found out which doctors different rabbis were talking to, it was like, well, they're not a real doctor. There's a better doctor. You know, it's like, no one wanted to crack the joke, but what do you call the doctor who came bottom of their class? Doctor. So once you're a doctor, you're a doctor. So what's interesting is, at what point are you a professional enough person to be trusted? And in halacha, there's this general idea that if you're a specialist, whether you're the best specialist or a good specialist, you're a specialist. And halacha has to listen, when it comes to issues of life and death, has to understand what the facts are as interpreted by the medical people and not just by statistics. So you need statistics and you need medical advice, and then you can formulate a halachic position. And so there was this interesting situation where people were using their mind to question, but at the same time, their belief system to accept. So while there was one group who did push back and they had ran their shul on Glen Road, you had many grumpy people who were like, this is the wrong decision, but we're going to go with it because it's the right thing. So this belief in the specialist is actually cardinal to Jewish legal thinking. But I wanted to ask, do you think, would it be wrong for me to say that a religious Jew lives with so many rules in their life, and some of those rules don't make sense, but a religious Jew may find it easier to keep certain rules, even if they seem nonsensical, because of our lifestyle? Or actually, is everyone wired to be able to keep rules, or those that don't keep rules are wired that way? Rob, in your opinion, and maybe Nora, from what you've seen in the corporate world, the people who try to cheat, are they cheaters, or is it something else that's going on?
If I might just jump in.
By the way, religious Jews also cheat. I'm not white. I'm not about to say there's a group who's better. I'm just asking about following rules and comfort levels with that.
I think when we as human beings have an external pressure or are stressed by a particularly impactful, significant event, we tend to seek the comfort in rules and structure because it's the known, yeah. And we also like to find comfort in leadership. And that's why during times of war and so forth, no matter who the sitting president is or prime minister is, their approval rating goes up, because people need a leader for them to feel secure and safe during times of stress. So I think during times of stress, people like rules to adhere to. I think the rules have to make some sense, because what we want, I think, is a sense of control, that we can control our destiny, that we can control getting or not getting the virus. And if we do X, Y, and Z, then we're less likely to get it. So if we really believe in the rule, of course, we're much more likely to follow it, because it gives us some self-determination. Why wouldn't we do it?
Yeah.
The problem is when we start, I think, when people have different interests. So, for example, I know people who've got a lot of properties, and right now they're suffering because they aren't getting any rent. And so they're thinking, these rules are too hard, too harsh, we don't need to follow them, what about all that? That then is where the science of the rules comes up against the emotion and the drives of the individual.
Yeah.
And emotion almost always trumps logic. That's the problem.
It's interesting because I've definitely spoken to people who have gone up to Mornington Peninsula, and it's like, I know the government said your second home is not your primary home, but come on, this is nonsense. And I've noticed we all have exactly what you said. We all have a threshold where we say, I go with everything, but not this. This is silly. And there's a cardinal principle that comes up in some schools of Hasidic thought, which is Mochshalat al-Lev, that the mind must always be regulating our emotional responses and our impulsive responses to things. And in a way, you said that the rules are a place of comfort because it's predictable and control. But in some ways, that's also where the infinite can be found, because when you can govern your emotions and keep a rule that makes no sense or offends you, because what do you mean I can't go to the Mornington Peninsula? I pay tax to the Mornington Shire. Well, I'm as much a resident as the next person. And we come up with all these logical justifications, which is not our mind, it's our heart driving our mind. And so if a person can say, I'm going to sacrifice my ego, the ego says, I'm going to Mornington Peninsula, I'm doing what I want on this. And when the mind says, no, there's a higher authority, and we're going to adhere to that higher authority, that is in Kabbalistic terms called sacrifice. You've just sacrificed the animal, the ego within. So every time any of us are confronted where our emotion says, this is nonsense, I'm leaving Brighton and I'm walking around the Tan, every time we do that, according to the Torah, we have just like fulfilled the greatest thing in the world, that overcoming of self. That is this incredible moment, the incredible threshold to cross.
So say that. So sorry. According to Torah, breaking the rule is good.
No. Breaking yourself, breaking the emotion that wants you to break the rule because it's illogical. So every time you don't go to the Mornington Peninsula, because the government has said so, even though you know it's absolute nonsense, every time you break yourself and keep that rule, you've like achieved incredible things.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
So Menachem, I think, first of all, again, it comes down to trust, that we trust that the government has our best interests at heart. And I think by and large, we are still a society that does put society over the individual, as the higher priority. The problem, I think, starts also to come out two aspects. One is that because, thank goodness, we haven't had it such a bad impact here with high fatality rates, etc., that trust then starts to wear down a bit on the edges. Is this really serious enough to warrant this? And then secondly, the problem is inconsistency. So when on one hand it was fine for you to be able to, for kids to go back to school, but it wasn't fine for children to see their grandparents. And so, and there was a 60-year-old teacher at school or something. So it was when you start having consistencies where it doesn't seem logic, then I think it starts to undermine the trust.
Yeah.
So I
see
think
after the Black Lives Matter protests that infuriated people.
I think you bring up a really good point, Nora, and I think, so you could have one, like you could go to school, but you couldn't see your grandma, or you couldn't go out for exercise. And, Ralph Epstein, the ABC radio journalist, who, conflict of interest, he's a friend of mine, he put it so well. He said, look, all these risks are additive. It's not like one is more than the other, but if you keep adding them on top of each other, then you increase your risk substantially. And I hadn't thought of it like that. And it was his way of educating, doing public education, which I thought was really good. I think once you understand some of the complexities, you're more willing to accept those rules. Because I thought exactly the same. I thought, come on, my kids can go to school, but I can't see my mum. That's crazy. And then I thought, no, hang on. They're additive risks rather than one or the other. So I think a lot of it comes down to explaining the rules, and some people do that very well. Yeah.
Do you think, and I haven't fully finished processing this thought, but I'll put it out there. Do you think that society we don't have a unifying set of values as a society of what we all aspire to live for as a country, as a society? And as a result, when we have these massive existential questions, such as what's more important, the national economy or some people's lives, that then drives a very logical argument of, hang on, we never shut the country down for the flu. Why are we doing it for this? And we start pulling the pieces of research that best support our opinion. And likewise, I want to visit my aging mother. Why are 10,000 people allowed to protest in the city, but I can't do that? Is it the inconsistency, or is it a conflicting of values? Like, obviously someone felt that the protesting about a person's death in America was something that we should possibly risk, or maybe there was no risk. Maybe I've just used charged language. Is there a shortage of national values to help us all say, well, hang on, we all understand this, because ultimately all life is more important than money, or ultimately the national well-being through economy is more important than a few people's lives? Like, are we lacking that as a fundamental set of doctrines or ideas that lie behind our constitution? Or maybe does it exist and I didn't know? Or is it too hard to expect a society to have that? Because I feel religious societies throughout history had that, rightly and wrongly. Go through Christian Europe and other things, rightly and wrongly. But is the West lacking something like that to help us ground our direction and decisions?
I'll jump in because Nora's left me a space, and I'm always accused of talking too much, so I'll live up to that reputation. Mate, I think there's a few things about this. One is, I think our common values are pretty strong. I mean, you look at the United States. My goodness, look at the difference in opinions and values and health systems and political affiliations, and how a mask becomes a political statement, for goodness sake. So I think here we're quite different. I think Australians are much more community minded, and I think there's a whole lot of reasons for that. Our history, we all vote, there's compulsory voting, and we take pride in it. I think we are pretty good with looking after our neighbours. We do have the sense of the values of liberty and freedom of expression and following the rules, but not always. And sometimes they come up against each other in some of these rules. But I think more than anything, what this current crisis does, because it's an existential crisis. It's like, in terms of, it's about meaning in life. What it does is it brings these issues into sharp relief. And a lot of people are asking themselves, what are my values? What are my core values? What do I hold dear? What do we need to do as a society? What do we do together, and where are the fracture lines? And that is, if there's one tiny little thing that we can get out of this terrible crisis, is that we are reflecting more on those things, these really important issues that up until now, a lot of people don't think about too much,
Yeah.
So I absolutely agree with Rob that I think our basic value set is actually shared and strong. And again, look even at the decision Sweden made, sort of to not make basically any change in the way they were sort of going about their business, and and they were prepared to accept a mortality rate that was off the charts, whereas that was never acceptable to our leaders, to our society, and that's what we've followed through on. But within sort of a shared value set, there are still really difficult trade-offs that you have to still make. So again, we might all share the view that that we don't want unnecessary deaths in our society. And here, thankfully, we've had the support packages, whereas, for example, in the States, in some places, if you ignore sort of some of the nonsense that's going on at the leadership level, but at an individual level, there are people who, even if they are sick, there is no safety net. If they don't go to work, they don't know how they're going to feed their kids or how they pay for a roof over their heads. And so the choices are really stark. And so it's almost luxury of being able to say, I won't go to work because that's not the right societal thing to do because I might infect others, it's actually a choice that's not theirs because just the basic demands of living are such that they don't have it. There are people in this society who are also in that position, though thankfully not in anything like the numbers that we see in the States. But when you go to, protests against the Black Lives Matter, for example, again, the issues that people were caring about that was taking them out onto the streets were fundamentally values driven about, it's terrible that a black man goes out in the morning and his family doesn't know if he'll come home that night, just going about their normal business because they're targeted or treated in a way that would be unthinkable for a white person in their position. And so the values that drove people to say this was an opportunity to actually stand up and say this is no longer acceptable in our societies seemed really important as adhering to the rules that were being imposed on us because of the COVID situation. So I'm not sure it's because of a lack of shared values. It's just that those values, give rise to really, really hard and complex issues that we're facing. But I think, like Rob said, the really good thing is that we're at least having conversations and debates about them.
On that Black Lives Matter protest idea, because it wasn't a death in Australia, but rather a death in America, it remains a permanently important issue. But because it was timely in America, but not in Australia, could one argue, based on that hang on, there is a definite there's a definite virus here, and there are risks, and we're calling it one of the most infectious viruses ever. Should we be protesting something which actually is not going to change today or tomorrow, whether I protest or not, but going to the protest could potentially put people at risk today? So you've got a value, of course, all lives matter is an important value, but also the preservation of life right now. Do I actually have to put off that protest because real lives could be at risk right now just from turning up to the protest? In your opinion, I think we can all recognize there's a conflict. Which one trumps which?
So I think it wasn't just that it was about a really outrageous incident in the US. In fact, what happened, somebody made a comment, how terrible they are over there and look how good we are. And the point was made, actually, this stuff is happening here in Australia today. And 437 black deaths in custody in the last few years. Not one single person was charged about any of those. And I think the thing is, Menachem, that when there is such disruption as we're experiencing at the moment, they are actually quite unique opportunities to actually change societies, to make people are so dislocated that I think that there's suddenly an opportunity to actually make really big and fundamental changes. And so people said, for once, there was universal, global outrage at what was happening on those incidents. And actually, it wasn't just about something that's happening over there, it's happening right here amongst us. And if we think this is the wrong thing, we should actually stand up and say it.
Even at a health risk to a country or a city, at least. I mean, after the fact, we could see that it didn't lead to anything, but I'm not sure if the government permitted it because they knew factually it was safe, or whether it was just a punt that it should be okay, and this is a really important issue. But that aside, at the point where the question was being asked, do you really think that is more important than the real risk of
I think who knows, Menachem. So did I go to the protest? No, I thought it was a dumb thing to do. But I did actually drive past where people were congregating. They were mostly, from what I could see, young people, and in a sense, I admired the fact that they felt passionate about something that I thought was important. And, you know, most people seemed to have masks at the time when, you know, certainly masks weren't being mandated. I guess they were trying to do it in a safe way. I suppose the government was sympathetic to the cause. Was it in the end a sensible thing? Probably not. But the cause was important. I certainly believe that.
I'm pushing because I actually myself don't know what I really think on it for the following reason, or the following two reasons, and that is there is precedent this time of the year. In 9 days, we actually have the fast of Tisha B'Av, and one of the reasons why the second temple was destroyed, which the fast of Tisha B'Av commemorates, is because the priests refused to bring a sacrifice that Caesar had sent from Rome. And the reason why they refused it was because the sacrifice had an imperfection on the animal that the Torah says you cannot bring a sacrifice that has this imperfection, this nick on it. And they had this debate. On the one hand, it comes from Caesar, and as it was politically, it was extremely tense. But on the other hand, the Torah says you're not allowed to. And so the rabbi who was in charge on the day, his name was Rabbi Menachem ben Avkulis, and they came to him. Every day there was a different rabbi rostered to answer legal questions on temple service. It wasn't for the priest. The priest delivered the service, but it was the rabbi who was there to interpret situations like that. And he actually said, you cannot bring this sacrifice, no matter who it's from. Now, they ended up not bringing it. And when word got back to Caesar, that pretty much set the final wheels in motion that led to the siege of Jerusalem, the sacking of Jerusalem, and the destruction of Jerusalem, of which we've never rebuilt the temple since. And the Talmud says that it's because of the zealous behavior of Rabbi ben Avkulis that we lost the temple. It's very, very condescending and accusatory that he actually is responsible for the destruction of the temple. And you say, but hang on, that's the law. The law says not to. And the Jerusalem Talmud says, well, hang on, if you're the rabbi in charge, you should be able to understand the bigger perspective here. So that's why I'm uncertain. I'm not sure if I can marry up the two cases. But there's another interesting case that happened in the Kovno ghetto in 1941. In September 1941, there were around 30,000 Jews in the Kovno Lithuanian ghetto. And the Nazis had just invaded Lithuania, and they called in the community leadership of the ghetto, and they said, there are 30,000 of you, and we're going to give you 5,000 white cards. And whoever has a card is going to live, and whoever doesn't is going to be taken away. We're giving you the cards to distribute amongst the ghetto. You've got 2 days to do so. And they had no idea what to do. And Kovno was very much like Melbourne, a very mixed Jewish community, religious, secular, cultured, ultra-Orthodox, progressive, Zionist, anti-Zionist, all mixed together, just a bit smaller. And they decided to go to the chief rabbi of Kovno, who was in the ghetto, and they asked him, what should we do? If we distribute the cards, then we condemn 25,000 people to death. If we don't give out the cards, everyone gets killed. And if we give them out, can we give them to the people we love first? Because we've got the cards, like, or do we have to, how do we distribute? And there's a whole, and all the questions that were asked in that ghetto were recorded. And after the war, they were dug up. They were buried in cans, and they were dug up and published decades later by one of the survivors of the ghetto. And anyway, so the conclusion is that they had to give out the cards. And it's a very interesting Talmudic, he brings the Talmudic reference why he said they had to give out the cards and why they weren't actually liable. They weren't condemning anyone to death, but rather they were saving lives. But then the community body asked, we're going to give out the cards, but once people find out what these cards are, they're going to bribe, steal, bash each other to get hold of a card, because you'll take a card from a weak person if it means you can live. Should we call in the Nazis to create order as we're doing it, and should we call in the police, or do we allow chaos to ensue when we give out the cards? And the rabbi said you have to give out the cards, and people have to be allowed to do whatever it is that they need to do to protect themselves. And basically he sanctioned the possibility for people to bash one another, and that the strongest person will win, but you cannot bring in the law, because this is a situation where you have to allow that human or very violent human process to exist. So I'm not comparing either of those cases to the Black Lives Matter, but the reason why I'm torn is because on the one hand, you can't do things that are going to cause death, or even something that has the chance of causing death. But on the other hand, if you have a cause that is protecting your own self, you have to fight for that cause, even if it comes at a cost to others. So on the one hand, the law says you're not allowed to. On the other hand, the law says that the individual has the right to take the fight. And so therefore, the people who protested, were they saying, we don't care what the law is, this is our life that we're protecting, and that the government's or the law about the preservation of life is saying you're not allowed to protest, and actually they were both correct at the same time. You're not allowed to protest, and you have to protest at the same time. That's why I'm unsure what the correct position was.
This is the beauty of Judaism. I mean, we're made to ask questions all the time, and everything that Nora said, I fully agree with. Just what she said before. But imagine you're in government, and you know that next week there are, however many I know, 30,000 people that want to express their views about something incredibly important, and it's during a pandemic. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Are you going to say no and therefore risk a whole lot of chaos and melee and potentially violence? Are you going to say yes and potentially risk the spread of the virus? Or are you going to do something else? But the time was pretty short. So I think you've got to be practical about these things, Menachem. You know, I think...
Not the first time someone said that to me.
No. But in the abstract, you know, and I think that comes...
New South Wales sort of, you know, tried to go to court to get the order to ban the protest. They got it, then it was appealed and it was overturned. So even the courts couldn't, you know, consistently took different views on it as well. They're hard decisions.
Yeah.
Well, these are very hard decisions. I thought the rise of AI was going to be the trigger that led to the rise of religion and philosophy and the need to really process our thinking. But I think what's happened in the last 3 months has forced some of the biggest ethical questions that society has faced at one time. Have we lived in a time in history that so many different ethical questions were being presented that had such massive ramifications on every person next door? It's not like something on the other side of the world. It's not Tiananmen Square and now we'll analyze. It's like...
Yes, but I tell my kids exactly this. You know, my teenage kids, you know, there would be very few kids in the history of the world that have lived through something like this. I mean, this is of epic proportions, and it will certainly leave its mark on them and probably their kids for the rest of their lives. You know, not just the physical stuff of not being able to go play soccer with their mates, but it teaches, you know, it's a lesson, you know, it teaches them the value of all these things that we've just taken for granted, man, like going out to the park and kicking a ball with your mate, going to school, you know, who would have thought kids would miss school, you know, being able to visit your family, being able to go away on holidays, all these things which we just took for granted. Now they're thinking about those things, and when we are able to do them again, and we'll be able to do them again, I think we'll be doing them with a lot more relish, you know, and my kids will be telling their kids, hey, you know, there was a time when we couldn't leave our postcode. So, you know, if you want to go down to Wellington Peninsula for a holiday, that's pretty damn good, you know. Can I just say one other thing, Menachem? One other thing.
Sure.
I purposely brought out this book. Is it going around the right? No, it's called Existential Psychotherapy by Evan Yalom. And funnily enough, you know, I had to do a reading group with some of the doctors training to be psychiatrists, and this was the most perfect book to bring up in this time, because it's about the existential issues, about meaning. You know, where do we derive meaning from? What gives us meaning? Because we have to stop work, stop this, stop going out. We've got all this time, and you can fill it with Netflix and whatever. But at some point, you're going to have to ask yourself, what gives me meaning? in my
Yeah.
life? That's it. And a lot of us don't ask ourselves these questions because they're bloody hard questions. Anyway.
You know, it's what you were both saying, especially what you were just saying, Rob, about we're going to remember this. So, you know, in the Jewish tradition, we always say, you know, the custom is to do it like this because when we did that, we did it like that. And so, I've been joking with a lot of bat mitzvah families that aren't regular shul goers by any stretch of the imagination. And so they'll come to shul now during this period, well, not particularly right now, but 3 weeks ago. And everything in our tradition in shul has changed. Like the chazan takes the Torah out, puts it on the bimah, reads it, picks it up, dresses it. Like it's one person does everything. Like there are no call-ups. Like everything's been done differently. And like you're going to get a kid who in 30 years is going to go back to the shul for the first time and say, what's going on? When I was a child, there was one person that did everything. Or when we did Pesach, there was never family around. It was just us. Or high holidays, we always prayed in the garage. Our custom is to pray in the garage with nobody else on the high holidays. Yeah? So this is in a way how customs and traditions are formed. And so we're living in a custom building era. So every Jewish practice we do now, realize they're going to be talking about it. For whatever you did a year ago, no one's going to talk about. Now it's going to be like, I remember COVID.
The Zoom Seder.
The Zoom Seder. Yeah, and back when rabbis were really relevant. So, they had real issues to address.
Yeah, too right.
I'll tell you an interesting Shabbos law that was big in New York. Because New York was one of the big epicenters in the Jewish world, and the rabbinate, rabbinate. There's no formal rabbinate anywhere in the world. Rabbinate is just if people like that rabbis put out proclamations together, then there's a rabbinate, and if rabbis don't or people don't, there's no rabbinate. But many rabbis in New York put out rulings that on Shabbos you must, if you have a family member who's in hospital, you must call the hospital multiple times every throughout the day on Shabbos. And the reason was because the hospitals were so busy that nurses were calling the shots. Forget doctors, nurses were deciding who got a ventilator, who got to see a doctor, who didn't, how long, and really whoever hucked the nurses more got their family member in deeper. So the rabbis actually said that you must call on Shabbos, because if you don't call, you could be responsible for a death, because the hospital system works on pressure. If you're not the one hucking, the next person will, and therefore your Shabbos keeping is going to lead to the death of someone. And so it was, these are, to come out and say you must break Shabbos in this way. We know Hatzalah get in their cars and someone has a heart attack, they drive. But for people in their homes to be told, and you can't walk to the hospital because that will take an hour or two, and you've lost time. You have to stay home, and you have to get on the phone because you can't go to the hospital. You got to huck people, and this whole, I think Jewish law has been challenged in ways that never been before.
Wow.
And to finish on a positive note with that, and if I could ask you both just to stand, we'll open up everyone, whoever wants to comment or ask questions, particularly Rob and Nora, because me, my number. Them, I'm not giving you their number. But what's interesting is that there is a view that Jewish law and Jewish practice is really about elevating the detail in this world. Shabbat is how we elevate the days of the week. Festivals are how we honor periods of the year. Kashrut is how we honor and elevate the spark in food, etc. So when you start dealing with nuanced law that has never really been looked at, you're elevating a part of the world that has never been spiritually engaged. And it says that Mashiach will come when all the sparks have been elevated, when there's nothing left to elevate. And so perhaps through the practices and the challenges that we're seeing today, which in some ways there is no precedent. Like we found precedent for Pesach, but I'll tell you now, there is no precedent for how does a Jewish community do their prayers and shofar if there is no shul open? It's never happened. In Europe, you had times that you couldn't go out for the Seder and that you were locked up because of anti-Semitism. But this is unprecedented. So we're going to have to really explore things that aren't even academically discussed. And hopefully in the merit of us confronting these challenges, it's not actually oh, we're going through a passage of challenge, but rather this might be the ultimate challenge that brings about some sort of Mashiach type turnover in the world, where there will be no more illness, there'll be no more destruction, there'll be no more famine, but the world will have reached a point of spiritual alignment, leading to physical alignment and social alignment and eternal perfection. So maybe, hopefully, please God. Can I unmute everyone? Rob and Nora, do you mind if I do that? We'll just let everyone. So I'll tell you what, better than unmuting everyone, because someone will have a toilet flushing or a pot, whatever. Just unmute yourself if you want to ask or share. I'm going to be fairly strict not to let people go on long monologues. You can set up your own Zoom, and I'll put it on the WhatsApp, and you can invite people to yours. But if you have a question or a comment, let's go there.
Whilst we're waiting for people to think about a question, Menachem and Nora, can I tell you what I've become really good at over lockdown?
Please.
Sourdough. I've been boring my friends senseless with sourdough Instagrams, pictures, recipes, taste. Like really, I've really become very good at making sourdough.
Are you getting those bubbles inside?
Yeast. Yeah, secret yeast.
No, we just made it from, you know, the old flour and water and let it bubble. It is as good as Baker Bleu, if you know Baker Bleu. It is. I mean, I'm tooting my own horn because my daughter and I did it together, so it's really her stuff. But you know, in that time when all these endless hours of what do I do, made sourdough, and so I can smell it. The reason I bring it up is because I can smell it baking downstairs. Talia's taking it out of the oven now. Oh, it smells so good. Oh.
And you get that crusty edge.
Oh, and it's full of bubbles.
So I have a question. I'm Menachem's very quiet congregant. Dr. Rob, two things. Firstly, here is my Medicare card, so you can use that card. When can I come over for some sourdough, please?
I tell you what, as soon as you have my guarantee, Stan, as soon as lockdown is over, we will meet up for some sourdough.
I'm happy to do that. I have a mask as well, and you can charge me. I'll bring a referral as well. Don't worry. Not charge me, charge the government.
I'll give you a piece for free.
So any questions or comments for Rob or Nora? Or
I've got a question. Can you
just press it on?
I've got a question. Can you hear me?
Yes. Now,
okay. My question is.
It's Harry speaking for Nora, and I can't see you. You're on Caroline's phone, but I know it's Harry.
Well,
turn the gallery on. Okay.
Okay. My question is, Menachem, could you give us a reconciliation of perhaps the religious version compared to what we were hearing about the book about the meaning you were talking about earlier? I forget the name of the book. Maybe you could repeat that. But is there a Jewish perspective on what you were saying with respect to the lecture you were giving?
Jewish perspective on what Rob was saying, on Rob's medical
well, maybe you want to tell us a bit more about, you know, if you can summarize in 5 words, the existential views in the book, and then get a comment from Menachem about it.
Rob, is that like the student that asked Hillel sum up the Torah on 1 foot, please?
It's 500 pages, but in essence, since you asked, it's a great question. So Irvin Yalom, who's you know, one of the paragons of psychotherapy. Anyway, bear with me. This will take 1 minute to get to your answer. So basically, he talks about he goes to an Armenian cooking school. This is the #1 therapist, you know, psychotherapist probably in the world at the time. He goes to an Armenian cooking school. And, you know, the teacher says, put in a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of this. And he does exactly the same, and the students do exactly the same, but it never comes out as good as hers. And then one day he sees, as she's taking it to the oven, after she's instructed the class, she throws in a few extra herbs, a bit of this, a bit of that. And he says, but hang on, you didn't tell us that. She goes, I just thought it needed it, you know. And so he then writes this entire book on psychotherapy about that. It's what we need at a particular time. It's those added extras that are beyond the structures of, you know, working and education and family. All these things are terribly important and are essential, but it's those other little things that give us meaning that we often forget, that we often don't look at, that we often ignore, and yet they're essential for the taste of life. So then he goes and explains that if when you're working with somebody as a therapist, that these are the things that you try and explore, and because they're so layered, almost archaeologically layered in the psyche, it takes a lot of work to try and uncover what gives particular meaning for a particular person. You know? And for me, it's a very trite thing, but for me, making sourdough was really important because it tapped into a whole lot of things. I don't want to bore you with it, but it reminded me of my dad when he used to make sourdough, and I used to laugh at him as a teenager, and it brought me together closer with my daughter who makes it as well. And this connection with a generation above and a generation below, and bringing the staff of life into the house. That's one small thing that gave me meaning. And these are the things that we need to look at, is what he's saying. We need to examine them and value them for what they are. There you go, 500 pages in 1 minute.
So Harry, I can't compete with that because that was good. But I can, you know, what would a rabbi without a counter? It's not a counter. Rob, before we came online, was talking about one of Jonathan Sacks's books. So Jonathan Sacks just put out a new book, and it is called Morality. Now, he's had some very good luck with that book because the first print really hit shelves just before COVID, and lockdowns definitely helped books sell. But then the second print came out at the time of the Black Lives Matter protests. And so, of course, that took them off the shelves yet again, because it is a very, very, it's a very interesting book, and I've read it. And he's got a whole section on the selfishness of self-help. He's quite cynical about the whole pursuit for meaning and all that. And this is Jonathan Sacks, who is a very, very progressive, open-minded person. I almost find the book is not so much his wisdom as much as his sharing of all the books he's ever read, which is actually in some ways as good as sitting with Rob just for a whole book. But it's very interesting. He's got this idea of the selfishness of the quest of self-help and the I versus the us, the I versus the we. There is a teaching from the Rebbe Maharash, I believe, and he says that to be able to sit and meditate for 8 hours a day and really transcend and move into different, there's nothing better and there's nothing more spiritual than that. However, the single act of doing a kind deed to another person allows you to access greater heights than any of those meditations ever would. Now, he's not being cute, because we find this a lot in Hasidic writing, that the random act of kindness is more profound than anything else. And this is the works of modern Kabbalah, Hasidism. And so for a mystical doctrine to say a random act of kindness towards another is more important than any meditative, mindfulness, prayerful moment is very interesting, because one must then deduce from that ultimate happiness and the greatest sense of meaning will only be ever attained in the moment that you're selflessly giving to another person. So it's almost when we give up the self that we discover that happiness. The Baal Shem Tov, who is the founder of Hasidism, so I can't reach the book that I want to hold up to the camera. Oh, it just looks like this, but it's different. And he was very much a believer of the idea of that God is everything and God is everywhere. And therefore, where you are is the most sacred space to be. With whom you are with the most sacred person, and the activity or the interaction between yourself and that person, or between yourself and an object, if you realize that there is a spark of the infinite residing within that individual, that object, and that your whole purpose of engaging is to connect with it, then you will live a life of meaning. And so basically we look at everyone and everything, so every bite of food, every time you sit on a chair, every person you engage with, look at them as a part of the infinite, and you'll never be short for meaning or purpose in any moment of your life, all the way through till the very final breaths, where that last breath is so sacred, and those last few people that you see are so holy, and that even the decrepit 105-year-old person who's comatose is as sacred as the 18-year-old spirited person who's just embarking on their quest of life.
But Menachem, I think that one of the really good things that we've seen during this period are lots of acts of random acts of kindness, and in fact, people contacting others that they've not had much contact with in recent times, and friends that you might have been too busy with work, etc., that people have stopped and reached out, or neighbours who they realise are living alone, or I think actually I think it's been really noticeable that people have stepped up in that way during this period.
And that's a sign of society, which is that when the mud hits the fan, if that is how we rally, then that's a very good barometer that not everything is broken at all. And it is incredible that way that people do rally, and it's not a bushfire. And I find that 2020 has been one of the most incredible years, because since the beginning of the year, it has been uncharacteristically incredible. We have the Aussie bushfires, which happen every year, and I apologize for anyone that's heard me talk about this, because I'm really moved by this. We have bushfires every year, but it doesn't mean that Oscars focus on it and Americans start donating money. Like hundreds of millions of dollars in charity to a country. We're a first world country. What do we need anyone's charity? And yet there was this outpouring. And then we had the coronavirus, and that impacted the whole world. And there was this mass willingness, by and large, to stay home and do selfless things like not work and compromise our income for the greater good of society. And then with the Black Lives Matter protests, we had this incredible outpouring and conversation around the value of life and people's and cruelty and racism and bias and many people have been killed. Many police have killed people. Many white people have died. Many black people have died. Many gay people. Everyone has their turn of being persecuted. But for whatever reason, this one caught the attention of the world. And the response, there was this resounding response of, we can't allow this. Now, these are incredible mass acts of kindness of spirit, and even, as you say, kindness in effort. And I think there's something really magical going on in society since the beginning of this calendar year. Which is again hasn't happened like that year in, year out. There's lots of goodness in the world, but not like what we're seeing today. So it's 9:15. Any other comments before I say my thank yous? Okay, so I just want to say firstly, thank you so much to Rob and Nora for trusting. We talk about trust. For trusting me that we could just have a conversation without any script, without any directive, and only just a general area where we'd go. I truly feel like it was almost the same as when we have our shiurim. I hope that everyone else enjoyed. We're going to do this again next week. I'm going to have other people, completely different subjects. Tomorrow at 12:30, we have our context and meaning conversation, which is where I'll be exploring this week's parasha like I would if we were in shul. Normally we read the Torah, and then whoever's in shul, we just really hash out what have we just read, and all questions are permitted, and you don't have to like what's there, and I have to try to help explain text, and it's that. It's not in text, but we're going to look at the texts. So that's 12:30 to 1:15 tomorrow. So hopefully that's during your lunch break or lunch time or whatever it is, but just a bit of meaning. But we'll do this again next Tuesday night at 8 p.m. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And really thank you, Nora, you work across so many time zones, being involved in companies here and overseas. So thank you. And Rob, who really has had to leave the kitchen. There is no guaranteeing your sourdough is going to work if you haven't been able to look through the oven window. Look. I mean, who's looking?
I can really. I'm hanging out to go down there, and they've probably already eaten most of it. But I just want to say thank you, Menachem, and thank you, Nora. It was a great, stimulating conversation. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen.
It's been great. Really enjoyed it.
And Stan, I'm baking a sourdough with your name on it.